A political shock as the Lib Dems overturn a massive Tory majority to win the Richmond by-election.
It's a good morning. Start of many more.
The Lib Dems claim the victory is down to their campaign against Brexit.
The people of Richmond Park yesterday voted to send a message to Theresa May that the British people did not vote for a hard Brexit that will damage our economy and future generations and our standing in the world.
We'll be looking at what this vote means and its possible implications for Brexit. Also tonight, the dangers faced by families fleeing the military offensive in Syria's eastern Aleppo.
Zainab is 10 days old. She's almost as old as this offensive against eastern Aleppo, born into the heat of the war.
Chelsea Football Club is accused of gagging a former player who alleged historical child sex abuse. Just 5 days after he finally wins the World Championship, Nico Rosberg stuns Formula One by retiring.
I know nothing.
And Andrew Sachs, the man famous for playing a hapless Spanish waiter in one of our best-loved comedies, has died.
In the south, we would have put a stop to it. A former manager of Southampton Football Club tells us he knew nothing about allegations of abuse. And pollution on a huge scale. A cruise ship's operator is fined more than £30 million.
Good evening. The unpredictable nature of British politics has been demonstrated yet again with a major upset in the Richmond by-election. The Lib Dems unexpectedly overturned a Conservative majority of 23,000 to win the constituency in southwest London. The election was sparked when the MP, Zac Goldsmith, resigned in protest at plans to expand Heathrow Airport. Goldsmith stood as an independent candidate, while the Lib Dems focused their campaign against the Brexit vote. Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, has more.
It's a good morning. Start of many more.
They'd forgotten what this feels like. So, to Liberal Democrats, pro-EU and proud, winning felt good.
Our newest Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament, the wonderful Sarah Olney.
And referendum or no referendum, the new MP claimed she had every right to vote against Brexit.
So that's the commitment I made in my campaign, and my by-election victory means I've got my, a personal mandate from the voters of Richmond Park that that's what they want me to do.
But just step back, a tiny rump of Lib Dems still looks tiny. You sound optimistic, you always do, you're a Liberal Democrat.
Yes,
But let's be realistic.
Yep.
What difference will this result make? You've still got a mile to go.
So, I mean, generally speaking, by-elections don't change governments, but they have a habit sometimes of changing government's direction.
So what difference will this by-election make?
At the moment, Theresa May is listening to her UKIP-ish wing, which now appears to control the Conservative Party. Now maybe she'll listen to some panic-stricken Tory MPs with Liberal Democrats breathing down their necks who will say, hang about, isn't it time you listen to the electorate, who may or may not want Brexit, but they certainly don't want a hard Brexit.
You could still get all the Lib Dems MPs into the kind of people carrier they use around here for the school run. But Remain supporters far beyond this posh corner of southwest London may take satisfaction from this result. They never went away, they just went quiet. And for Theresa May, striking an EU deal capable of pleasing this deeply divided country now looks harder than ever. What a turnaround, though. A 23,000 Tory majority became a 2,000 lead for the Lib Dems.
Are you going to stay active in politics, Zac?
Millionaire environmentalist Zac Goldsmith looked crushed. He forced the by-election over expanding Heathrow, which he's against, but then lost it over Brexit, which he supports. Leavers had to make the most of it.
The government's job is to represent the people of the whole of the United Kingdom, not one parliamentary seat, and our job will be to make sure that Brexit goes ahead, because that is the instruction that the British people have given to their government.
What has heartened me is that those people who voted Remain have stood up, and I think now they will begin to be listened to and brought in.
EU negotiator, former Belgian PM Guy Verhofstadt hoped so. He tweeted, "Congratulations, Europe's watching and we're proud." Around Richmond, people felt they'd sent a message.
I like Zac and I would have voted for him, but this is bigger than Heathrow. This is about the whole country now. It's about Britain and Europe.
I mean, it can only do some good, if anything. It can only make things slightly better from my point of view, anyway. So
It'll cheer you up anyway.
yeah, it's cheered me up. I woke up this morning with a smile on my face.
A big day for Lib Dems then, which may make Tories think twice about an early election. That leaves the struggle for Britain's future after Brexit, a contest neither side is giving up just yet. John Pienaar, BBC News.
While the result in Richmond has underscored Britain's political divisions, the economic divisions among the UK's regions are currently among the widest in Europe and are getting bigger. That's according to the Bank of England's chief economist, Andy Haldane. The latest figures show that the highest household worth lies in South East England at £340,000. That's almost 2.5 times more than the lowest, the North East, at £150,000. The bank says the figures are worsening, partly due to lack of investment and skills. Our economics editor Kamal Ahmed reports from Redcar.
The old steelworks in Redcar closed last year, 2,000 jobs lost. Although there are winds of optimism here, many of those 2,000 people have found new work. Teesside is a region less wealthy than its southern neighbours, London and the South East.
Hello. 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 Hello, Rebecca. Hi. Nice to see you. I'm Andy. Hi, I'm Andy. Nice to see you.
Andrew.
Andrew Haldane, the Bank of England's chief economist, here to take the temperature. A tattoo parlour, a clothing shop, a dry cleaners, small businesses that are the backbone of any town. At a visit to a steel research lab, he told me those regional inequalities were getting worse.
If you look at the level of income within region per head, it's only really London, the South East, where that's back above the levels it was before the crisis. In pretty much every other part of the UK, we are yet to move materially back to those pre-crisis levels.
The local view is mixed. There's confidence from shop owners.
Everybody seems to be smiling. I don't really see anybody like doom and gloom, and I think things have moved on.
And the feeling that London just gets a little more help.
Every time something negative happens, you expect the government to jump in and try and help out. We're not really getting any kind of real help coming in from the central government, if you want.
Theresa May has spoken about just managing families. She could just as easily have spoken about just managing regions like here in Redcar. There are lots of positive developments in areas like this. For example, the unemployment rate is falling faster than the national average. But when compared to the powerhouse economic regions of London and the South East, places like Redcar are falling further and further behind. You've heard the criticism. Your policies of money printing have been to help the banks and, frankly, to help the city, to help London, to help the South East. It hasn't done much to help places like here in Redcar, has it?
Quantitative easing and lower interest rates, the two tools we have at our disposal, have helped lift the fortunes of all of the regions across the UK, including here in the North East. Without monetary policy easing, I think economic activity here may have been 7-8% lower than it currently is. That is not to be sniffed at.
No one wants to see the sun set over places like Redcar, and Mr Haldane urged investment in skills and business performance to increase wealth across the whole of the UK. That is the challenge for the government. Tough, long-term policies that take many years to deliver. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News, Teesside.
Tens of thousands of people have fled the intense fighting in the Syrian city of Aleppo over the last few days. The government offensive in the east of the city has retaken around a third of the territory held by rebel groups. Desperate families crossing into government-held areas have been speaking of the dangers they faced during their escape. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, is in government-controlled western Aleppo tonight. And Lise, the people there have escaped the immediate danger in the east, but they still face considerable hardship, don't they?
Yes, indeed. Aleppo is truly the city of the dispossessed. More than 400,000 people have fled into this part of Aleppo in recent years to escape the fighting. And there's been a tide of people in recent weeks. Most of them are going to an area which was itself once the scene of heavy fighting.
An abandoned warehouse in a derelict industrial zone on the outskirts of Aleppo. cold, bleak. Not what any child would recognize as a home. This is where thousands who fled East Aleppo are taken when they arrive in the government-held West. Some bringing only the clothes they were wearing. They're safe, but exhausted. Fadila Tata fled with her husband and 5 children. We're happy we left, she tells me. There was heavy shelling there, and our children were starving. It's better here. But no one wants to keep their children here for long.
Zainab is 10 days old. She's almost as old as this offensive against eastern Aleppo, born into the heat of the war, now living here in the freezing cold of winter in such a bleak, bleak place to start life.
Fuad is only 15. 3 months ago, he lost his leg when his workplace was shelled.
There were no good doctors. My leg kept bleeding, so they had to cut it off. There was a hospital, but there were no medicines. I was in great pain.
It's not the only tragedy in this family. Last year, the eldest son was killed by shelling. Then on their journey here, they say they came under fire from rebel fighters, trying to stop them from leaving. Everyone has a story, each one sadder than the next. Ayman, Mahmoud, and Fatima are all profoundly disabled. Last week, their mother abandoned them. Their father Mohammed was a civil servant before the war.
We were sitting at home. The house next to us was hit and destroyed. I told my children, prepare yourselves, we're leaving. Some good people helped carry my children to safety. And now we are stuck here.
It's playtime for the children in this temporary shelter. It's not just about having fun. Most of these children have only ever known war. They all grew up in a rebel area opposed to President Assad. Today they're being taught to chant slogans to praise him. Too little to understand this war, never too little to be caught up in it. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Aleppo.
It's emerged that just last year, Chelsea Football Club paid £50,000 to a former player who alleged he'd been abused by a coach as a child, but with a confidentiality clause which meant he couldn't repeat that allegation publicly. The clause has now been lifted, enabling Gary Johnson to claim he was abused by Chelsea's former chief scout Eddie Heath in the 1970s. Chelsea say they've appointed a law firm to investigate a former employee. Here's our sports news correspondent Richard Conway.
It's important that everyone knows how to raise any concerns about the child's welfare.
It's every young footballer's dream to captain their country. Today, every England captain told those children the most important first step is to stay safe. The FA video comes on the day the child abuse scandal within football widened. The former Chelsea player Gary Johnson spoke out about being abused by the club's ex-chief scout Eddie Heath, and he alleged a settlement was paid to cover up his claims.
For them to pay the money that they paid with an order tells you that, you know, they really didn't want to admit or help myself for fear of being exposed.
It was in 1973 when Gary Johnson claims Eddie Heath abused him for the first time. Despite the abuse at the age of 18, his talents took him to the heart of Chelsea's first team. In 2014, he contacted police and was referred back to Chelsea. Last year, the club agreed to pay him £50,000, but the agreement was subject to a confidentiality clause. But this week, the club allowed him to speak. One potentially serious issue for Chelsea is whether they informed the Football Association about this allegation of abuse. Premier League rules require clubs to forward any evidence of abuse to both them and to the FA.
I think it's only right and proper that we conduct our own investigation, aided by external solicitors, and then when that investigation is complete, we will pass all information to the FA. and then they can have a look at it, and they would be the appropriate ones to decide whether the club acted appropriately throughout.
Eddie Heath, who is now dead, is alleged to have abused Gary Johnson hundreds of times in the early 1970s. For those who played in amateur London football during that era, the claims against Chelsea's former scout have not come as a surprise.
Friends of mine told me he got in the showers with them at after football matches. None of them ever said that he touched them or anything like that, but he actually got in the showers with those kids.
Today, football's present addressed its dark past with the hope of ensuring a brighter future. Richard Conway, BBC News, Chelsea.
The United Nations is warning that millions of people are facing severe food shortages in northern Nigeria, an area that's seen years of fighting between government forces and the Islamist rebel group Boko Haram. The UN says around 400,000 children are already suffering acute malnutrition, and without urgent help, many will starve to death. It's appealing for $1 billion of humanitarian aid. Our correspondent Martin Patience has been to Maiduguri, where a small number of international volunteers are struggling to cope with a growing crisis.
They've survived Boko Haram, the Islamist militant group that's devastated this region. But as Nigerian forces regain territory, the full scale of the suffering is being revealed. Starvation. Millions are at risk. Those in this clinic are at least getting some help. Ali is too. He's suffering from severe malnutrition, weighing less than half of what he should. His mother, Zara, says sometimes they didn't eat for 3 days straight. And then there's 1-month-old Mohamedou. His body bloated from malnutrition. His mother, Aisha, has 6 other children to feed. It's unbelievably difficult to get food here, she says. I have to send my children out to beg. Those who have fled the fighting now live in sprawling camps. Nigeria's government says it can't cope with the growing crisis.
People are dying for the lack of food. We see over 400,000 children severely, acutely malnourished. I mean, that's huge numbers. 1.5 million people displaced, upwards of 7 million people not able to cope with their basic food needs.
Kawa and her 2-year-old son, Abdullahi, fled their village last month. He's been treated for the effects of starvation.
The Boko Haram men were in our village. There was no food, no drinking water. And even if we bought food, the militants would take it off us. Life is a little better here, but my main problem is feeding my children.
This is a conflict that's engulfed the region, bringing misery to millions. Some of the areas are still controlled by the militants. They can't be reached. And conditions there will almost certainly be worse than here. After years of violence, this conflict is now turning into a wider crisis. And hunger could end up killing more people than Boko Haram. Martin Patience, BBC News, Maiduguri.
Rail fares are to rise by an average of 2.3% in the new year, the biggest rise in 3 years. The increase comes into force from the 2nd of January. Separately, the government has set aside £15 million as a one-off payment to compensate passengers on Southern Rail for months of disruption. Philip Larkin, who wrote some of the most memorable lines in 20th century English verse, has been honoured tonight with a memorial in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Larkin, who died 31 years ago today, once grumbled that Poets' Corner was getting too full. But this evening, a space was found for him among some of the literary greats, as our arts editor Will Gompertz reports.
What are days for? Days are where we live. They come, they wake us, time and time over.
Philip Larkin reciting his poem Days back in 1964.
Solving that
question brings the priest and the doctor.
And Sir Tom Courtenay reciting it this evening.
Running over the fields.
At a service to mark Larkin's entry into Westminster Abbey's famous Poets' Corner. Blake Morrison, the author and poet, gave an address.
When he passed up the opportunity of being Poet Laureate, and Ted Hughes was named instead, he joked in a letter to Kingsley Amis that the thought of Ted being buried in Westminster Abbey is hard to live with.
This is Poets' Corner, a smallish area of Westminster Abbey which has been set aside for over 400 years to celebrate and commemorate the great masters of the written word. There's Byron, Auden, Eliot, Tennyson, Thomas, Chaucer, Browning, Hopkins, Hughes, and now Philip Larkin.
He cared greatly, I think, about being remembered, about ordinary people who liked his work, reading it, and as they file through Poets' Corner now, people will see his stone and think, well, yes, Larkin, he's a good poet.
He would have preferred to have been a novelist, and he didn't think he was good enough. But as I say, unlike the novelist, the poet isn't committed to introducing the unfamiliar. He's engaged in recreating the familiar. And I thought, gosh, think about that. That's poetry.
The inscription on Philip Larkin's stone is from his poem An Arundel Tomb.
To prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love.
Will Gompertz, BBC News.
There's been a big shock in the world of Formula One. Driver Nico Rosberg, who finally achieved a lifetime's ambition to win the World Championship only last weekend, has announced he's retiring from the sport. The German Mercedes driver fought a bitter battle against his teammate, Britain's Lewis Hamilton, winning the title in the last race of the season. Here's our sports correspondent, Andy Swiss.
Proof that in Formula One, things really do happen quickly. Just 5 days ago, Nico Rosberg was on top of the world. But the greatest moment of his career turned out to be the last. Today, to shock, he made an announcement that stunned his sport.
I've decided to end my Formula One career in this moment here. Ever since I started when I was 6 years old, I had, a very, very clear dream, and that was to become Formula One world champion.
Rosberg said the strain of this season had affected his family, his wife and their baby daughter, and his rise to the top has been a grueling one. His rivalry with Lewis Hamilton brought divisions and collisions, but earlier this week, a sense of closure perhaps. Hamilton congratulating Rosberg with a photo of them as youngsters. We said we'd be champions back then, now we both are. One man who knows all about staying at the top, though, said he was surprised.
It's shocking, you know what I mean? All his dream was to win a title, and he's got what he wanted, and he's got a young child now, so he just wants to focus on that. So if that's what you want, why not do it?
In sport, not many get to go out at the top. Cantona! In football, Eric Cantona was just 30 when he announced his shock retirement. In tennis, Wimbledon champions Bjorn Borg and Marion Bartley were even younger when they hung up their rackets. Now Nico Rosberg has exchanged a £15 million salary for a slightly slower pace of life. His race is run, but what a way to go out. Andy Swiss, BBC News.
Tributes have been paid to the actor Andrew Sachs, who's died after a long illness. He was most famous for his portrayal of the hapless Spanish waiter Manuel in the sitcom Fawlty Towers. John Cleese, who starred in and co-wrote the comedy, said Sachs had created one of the great comic characters. David Sillitoe looks back at his life.
Let me explain. Okay, inside. Not you! I quit! Get out!
Poor Manuel, the bruised, poked and permanently put upon waiter from Barcelona.
I am English. Hello.
The phrase comedy classic is desperately overused, but with Fawlty Towers, it's a fact.
I can speak English.
Andrew Sachs and John Cleese created some of television's most memorable comic moments. On screen, one tormented the other. Off screen, they were friends for more than 40 years.
The wonderful thing about Andy is if you met him, you would never for a moment guess he was Manuel, because he was quite quiet. He was almost like an academic or a retired banker or something like that, rather quiet but humorous. Put the moustache on him and he just changed personality. It was extraordinary.
I saw breakfast. Oh, let's see you then.
John Cleese had seen Andrew Sachs on stage and knew there was his Manuel. His background had been BBC drama and Brian Rix's farces. Britain was a place of safety after his family had fled Nazi Germany. But the set of Fawlty Towers was anything but safe.
This Basil, this smack on head.
He suffered burns in this scene, and then came the frying pan.
At the last moment of one of the episodes, he has to hit me on the back of the head with a frying pan, thinking I'm a burglar. And there was, I didn't learn this until 4 years afterwards, that there was actually 2 frying pans there. One was padded, one wasn't. Ah. And he only confessed 4 years later that he hit me with the one that wasn't.
No, sir. Uno, dos, tres.
Manuel was famous around the world, but Andrew Sachs was quiet, reserved, happy to hide behind the moustache. He appeared in so much over the years, but he'll be remembered for those 12 perfect episodes.
It's a rat. What? I know nothing. No. Nothing. No, forget that. No, I forget everything. I know nothing. No, you can tell her. You can tell her.
Andrew Sachs, 60 years of stage, screen and radio, and one comedy masterpiece.
No, I know nothing. I am from Barcelona.
The actor Andrew Sachs, who's died aged 86. And that's it from us. Now on BBC One, it's time for News Where You Are. Have a very good night and a great weekend.